Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the international affairs, foreign policy, and global development community, and world news aficionados of all stripes. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. This April, the White House announced that President Biden has nominated Sarah Margon as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. This is the top American global human rights watchdog and the most important human rights position in the U.S. foreign policy bureaucracy. Back in 2015, I had Sarah Margon on this podcast for a long-form interview about her life and career in human rights. At the time, she was the Washington director at Human Rights Watch, and since then, she has worked at the Open Society Institute, which was her post when she was nominated for this senior administration position. So I thought it would be interesting today to re-release this now 6-year-old episode, which does a good job of introducing listeners to Sarah Margon's personal and professional background, including some of the key events that shaped her worldview and her understanding of human rights. This episode kicks off with a conversation about a recent trip to Iraq she took as part of a Human Rights Watch research team investigating alleged human rights abuses there. And then it turns into a conversation about Sarah Margon herself and her life and career. This episode is a good distillation of what the podcast sounded like in the first 2 or 3 years of its existence, which included interviews and conversations with people who have led really interesting careers in foreign policy, who discuss their life and careers with digressions about some of the historic foreign policy events in which their life and career intersected. Most of these episodes are now available exclusively to premium subscribers. If you'd like to become a premium subscriber, you can follow the links in the show notes of this episode or go to globaldispatchespodcast.com or visit patreon.com/globaldispatches. Premium subscribers unlock these bonus episodes and receive complimentary access to my daily global news clips service. And if you become a premium subscriber in the next month, I will send you a copy of For the Love of Hong Kong, a memoir from my city under siege by Hannah Mahon Davis, the debut publication of the new Global Dispatches book imprint. It is a fantastic book, extremely well written, and I have a few more copies that I am able to give away. So please let me know if you'd like a complimentary copy to go along with your subscription to the podcast. Thank you. All right, now here is my 2015 conversation with Sarah Margon, now Biden's nominee for Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor.
To have that time to be traveling sort of under the radar with a translator, and that's it, not with a large delegation or event, to go to places that not a lot of Americans are going to on a regular basis.
Yeah, so can you actually describe, how does that work? A Human Rights Watch researcher goes to Kurdistan. How do you go about doing your interviews? How do you fly under the radar like that?
So it's a lot of logistical work, and our researchers really do this, and they develop the contacts and the relationships with people. Some of it is with journalists, both international and local. Some of it is with community-based organizations, civil society that works there, academics. And over a period of time, we develop relationships with these individuals. And, they're handed off from researcher to researcher so that the contacts aren't lost. But every researcher obviously develops their new contacts. So we have a fixer that we work with and usually travel in one small car. It's not an armored car. It's not a truck. It doesn't have a flag on it. And we try to pick up as many local customs as we can in an appropriate way, of course, so that we're respectful and adhere to sort of the laws and regulations, of course. We have security conversations before we go into every single situation, many of which are complex situations, to make sure that our security advisor and our program director feels comfortable with everything.
And so is your goal to just speak to as many people on the front lines as possible, to like collect as many stories as possible?
It depends on what we're researching, right? So the researchers have a very specific focus. They'll get a tip or some information, and then they'll start to track it and to get evidence and to get analysis and to basically to recreate the situation with as much information and details as they can. And we do that any number of ways. In countries where we can go to, we do it by sitting with the victims or the witnesses or their families. And talking to, sometimes it's also with security force officials who are willing to talk if security forces are implicated, or in some cases if security forces did the right thing and were protecting people. In the case of Iraq, for example, we spent some time with the Peshmerga field commanders because what we were looking at was Shia militia abuses in the aftermath of the Amerli airstrikes this past August.
Can you describe that, the situation, the Amerli airstrikes and that situation for people who aren't as familiar?
Yeah, sure. So Amerli was a small town that was under siege by ISIS, and it's a Shia town. And so while the U.S. had been trying to dislodge ISIS from the air, on the ground, the Peshmerga and the Shia militia had been working sort of to dislodge ISIS on the ground. And so it was considered a success and a successful collaboration when, in fact, ISIS was dislodged or defeated and moved on. The story that we've been looking at in the aftermath of this, and I've written a little bit about this as our researchers, is that while Amerli was a Shia town, what surrounded it were a number of Sunni villages. And so in the aftermath of what was seen as a very successful liberation of this town, a number of different Shia militias absolutely ransacked the Sunni villages, many of them that were around that town, and displaced thousands and thousands of Sunnis. They were incredibly brutal. They lit fire to and destroyed civilian homes. And so what you're looking at, and what our forthcoming report will talk about in great detail, is this dynamic that has been set up where ISIS goes in under the name of supporting and liberating Sunnis, and then the Shia militia come in to quote-unquote fight ISIS and end up wreaking havoc, and in many cases displacing or killing Sunni civilians simply because they're Sunni.
And so these Shia militia are more or less aligned with the Iraqi government, right? Which itself is more or less aligned with the United States.
I would say they are more than just aligned. I would say the militia have infiltrated the security forces, which all but melted away last summer when ISIS gained so much ground. And they are, in many cases, leading the fight on the ground as part of the security forces or in tandem with the official security forces. And the new minister of the Interior is head of one of these militias. So yes, very closely linked.
How's the U.S. role in this? I mean, the U.S. is presumably backing the Iraqi government, which you say are sort of, kind of been infiltrated by militias, and the U.S. government also is supporting the Peshmerga. So does the U.S. have any responsibility or culpability in some of these massacres of Sunnis that you sort of describing?
Yeah, this is what we've been looking at. This is the uphill battle that I've been, at the very least, trying to educate U.S. government officials about and make sure that they're aware of just how severe the situation is. Because it's not only that the U.S. is providing support both in terms of training, advising, and equipment, and has been for many years to the Iraqi security forces, but we saw a lot of evidence that a lot of the equipment that the U.S. has provided to the government has just basically been siphoned off or maybe even given to these militias. So that's a violation of a whole bunch of U.S. laws. And there hasn't been a lot of recognition publicly that the Shia militia are posing a very serious threat and making the sectarian problems in Iraq worse. There, as I understand it, have been private conversations about it. But the problem is, unless it's acknowledged and addressed up front at the same time that you're fighting ISIS, it's going to cause a lot of problems down the line.
Now, you investigated this one incident. Do you know if there are others, or what the scale of Shia abuses against Sunni civilian populations in the name of fighting ISIS? What's the scale of that?
It's pretty widespread. I mean, it's not just Sunnis that the Shia militia go after, to be clear, but that tends to be sort of the main focus. There was actually a New York Times report a couple of days ago, maybe last week, about a massacre in Diyala province. So you're starting to see, even in the last 4 or 5 months since I was there, a lot more media about this. And I mean, to be honest, this is not new. This has been happening for a long, long time, right? The invasion of 2003 enabled so many militia groups to be created and to run rampant with impunity. And it's gotten worse in recent, and many of these militias have been emboldened by the need to fight against ISIS. There has been a call to join militias by many of the leaders of them. So it's quite widespread. It's quite problematic. Anbar province is a region that we can't access. It's just too dangerous right now. But we understand that the militias are leading the fight there, and it's been incredibly aggressive and incredibly brutal because people who are living in Anbar don't really have access to electricity and water on a regular basis. So they're already suffering without their basic services, and now they're not only getting airstrikes by the Iraqi security forces from the air, of course, but also attacked on the ground.
Is there a readily available solution? I know in Human Rights Watch reports you usually issue recommendations.
Yeah.
What's your recommendation to the U.S. government on this, just to sort of be more cognizant of what your partners are doing?
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of using a horrible overused phrase, there's no silver bullet for this one. But the start is certainly to make sure that it's talked about publicly and that the administration is making sure that the Iraqi government is dealing with it. There's been some initial cosmetic steps that I certainly hope will trickle down and have an impact on the ground. It's not just about forming an inclusive government per se in Baghdad. It's also about making sure you create an integrated security force that protects the population, doesn't prey on it, which is what's happening now. And there needs to be steps to address accountability and impunity over the long term. But, some initial measures that could be taken would be for Prime Minister Abadi to make sure that all equipment, Iraqi security force equipment, is not falling into the hands of the militias, to make sure that there are no attacks against civilians or non-military targets, to send those guidelines down to the battlefields, to make sure that everybody who is fighting in the name of the Iraqi government is wearing uniforms and is clearly understands battlefield guidelines and laws. Those are some very initial tangible measures that could make a difference in the near term. And then some of those other issues that would require greater institutional reform obviously have to be implemented sort of more slowly as the security sector gets reformed.
So if we can switch gears now, I was trying to think of the first time we met. It must have been in the early 2000s when I was kind of writing on issues related to the UN and human rights, and you were an expert in these fields. But I realized that I have really no idea where your expertise comes from, or really where you come from, what your background is. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity to talk to you about that. Where are you from? Where were you born? That's it. I'll just kick off with the most basic question and see where that takes us.
I'm so happy the gears have switched. It's nice to have both sides of questions like this. It may not surprise you that I'm a native of Brooklyn, New York.
Aha. Okay. An actual native. Most people I know have moved there from the tri-state area, but you're born and raised?
Not born in Manhattan, and then, as I like to joke, rushed home over the bridge.
Okay.
But yes, completely raised in Brooklyn with an immense amount of Brooklyn pride. When I lived in Brooklyn growing up, it was not cool. Nobody wanted to go there, and lots of people say, "Oh, you're from Brooklyn? Do you have a gun?" And I sort of looked at them like they're crazy, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" my friends used to joke that I was going to lead a campaign, a one-woman campaign to make Brooklyn an independent nation.
Okay. Brooklyn independence movement. I figure we're probably about the same age, right? You're probably in like the late 70s, early 80s born.
A little older than that.
A little older than me. Okay.
Yeah. A little older. Yeah.
And so, what were your parents doing?
Oh God, back at that point, my father was a professor at Brooklyn College. He was a historian of American history, and I think my mother was running a medical education program at Downstate College. And they bought this little house in the early 70s in Brooklyn, and everybody thought they were crazy for moving to Brooklyn. And then I came along, and little by little, more of their peers started moving out to Brooklyn from Queens or Manhattan, and suddenly had this like little, not really hippie, they like to think of it as hippie, but sort of semi-hippie community that they were part of.
And so I guess in this semi-hippie community, what was your exposure to issues of human rights or international affairs?
As I try to think back about sort of how I ended up on this path, I try to think, the early years, what was it? And I keep running up against a couple of things, although I would say my formative experiences and sort of what really drove me to be where I am now was not until much, much later in life. It wasn't like I, dreamed of working in foreign affairs when I was 5 years old and, set down that path from the beginning. But I think maybe in the early years, my most influential sort of opening to the world. My parents loved to travel, and we traveled a lot when I was young. So I always sort of knew about other communities and that other countries existed, and that in and of itself was interesting to me. One of my father's good friends from graduate school was actually a man from Sierra Leone, and they were very close, so I called him my uncle. And Uncle Gus was a minister in the foreign ministry, I guess, in Freetown in, maybe the 80s. And he would come, to UNGA every year, actually, and he would always come to see us and spend time with us and bring my parents these crazy gifts, ivory tusks and things that now I sort of suggest they don't put out on their mantle. And he was a big part of our life, and I knew that he had a family back in Freetown, and he always would say, when you are graduated from high school, you will come to Freetown and you will work for me in the ministry and live with my family. And you'll have this experience with your Uncle Gus. And I thought, how great. And when I graduated from high school, even before we graduated from high school, Sierra Leone erupted into conflict. And so we didn't see Gus anymore. And there was no way I was going to Sierra Leone, obviously. But it always stuck with me. And in the end, his family got airlifted out of Freetown, and actually he now lives in London and as a refugee. And it was a pretty formative story for a young person to sort of know, that this had happened and that he had been such a presence in my life and then had disappeared because he literally couldn't get there anymore. When I went off to college, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut.
That's also sufficiently hippie, I think.
Sufficiently hippie and progressive, but I was sort of all over the map. And I started getting really into American history and American studies, and I guess following in my father's footsteps a bit, and became really interested in race relations and poverty issues and cultural issues in the United States. And for a long time thought that I was going to pursue that path and sort of try to deal with a lot of the issues that we face, in fact, that we seem to be facing, more now than ever. On the domestic landscape. And when time for graduation came, I suddenly got terrified of working. I wasn't ready to have a job, and I didn't like the idea of being in an office, and I couldn't figure out what to do. So a friend and I decided that we were just going to do something kind of, crazy, and we moved to Eastern Europe. And it was a couple of years.
About what year was this?
So this was 98.
Okay.
So it was less than 10 years after the wall had fallen, and we moved to Budapest, I should say. And it had sort of democratized at that point enough so that it felt somewhat like you could understand the country and you could see where it was going to go. You could see its trajectory forward, both in terms of simple things like commercial, restaurants, music, this interest in engaging with the West, but yet it still had this fundamental core of being very formerly Soviet. And it was sort of a wild place and a wild time to be there. And I also was there. I stayed through the Kosovo conflict. So Hungary joined NATO, and then Kosovo, the conflict happened. And so I was suddenly aware of a lot of the issues that I had studied in college on a very real level, cultural issues and sort of communities that were experiencing, repression and things that they, basically social change and social injustice, I guess is the best way to put it. And it was really eye-opening.
And how long did you spend in Hungary?
Well, to be totally truthful, it was a pretty difficult and miserable year because it was just really cold. And although I learned a lot and actually loved the country, but it was a really difficult year. And I only stayed a year. And then I came back and decided I was ready to have a job. I sort of had my adventure. I had worked with Kosovo refugees and a whole bunch of other refugees that, had found their way to eastern Hungary, which was, included people from West Africa and Afghanistan. It was kind of incredible. And I came back and I ended up getting a job at the Soros Foundation in New York. And that basically is what, that sort of final experience just propelled me on, I like to think of that as the early days of the path I'm on
Soros
now.
being Hungarian, of course, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the fact, at that point it was OSI, and OSI was still pretty small.
That's the Open Society Institute for people who aren't down with the lingo.
Right. Sorry, it was Open Society Institute. It was pretty small, and I think the fact that I had lived in Hungary for a year was, that was interesting to them.
And they were focused on that at that point, right? Like OSI was very much focused on the democratic transition in Eastern Europe. That was like the main Soros's main focus for many years, right?
Yeah, the scope of their work was a lot smaller at that point, and so it's not every American or every New Yorker that puts on their resume, I just spent a year in Hungary.
Mm-hmm.
So
what? Yeah.
It ended up being like a great next step.
And so at OSI, what kind of work were you thrust into?
I was doing a whole bunch of different things. I was doing a lot of communications work, actually. I was an assistant, so I was also doing, people's expenses, things like that, which apparently I was pretty terrible at. Breaking copier machines, the usual. I did get a chance as things started to melt down and fall apart in former Yugoslavia to do some work on Serbia and to meet with and support some of the opposition there, which was the Otpor, the youth opposition, which was pretty exciting.
What was your work with them like? Because that group, the Otpor, is so, I think, impressive. Will you just, I guess, maybe describe for people who aren't aware of what that is and like how they were able to topple Milosevic? Just kind of tell that story.
Yeah, I mean, to be totally honest with you, I don't even remember all the details of what my support was. It was a little bit of a blur, but they were an incredibly young and dynamic student group who had been able to, sort of the early days of social media and organizing, and had been able to gather together to push information out on, if I'm not mistaken, it was an early blog. And that was actually one of my roles, was to help them translate, even though I didn't speak any appropriate languages, but to help fix the English language that they were writing so that the rest of the world could see what they were doing, and basically to get information from the ground and share it with others. And they were able to create links throughout communities within Serbia and across different ethnic lines as well, if I'm not mistaken. And it was incredible. They were so young. I mean, they couldn't have been much older than me. And I flew to Budapest at that point, and they a number of sort of the core blogging team had moved up to Budapest for their own safety. And we were working there, 15, 20 hours a day. And if I recall correctly, it started with a vodka and it ended with a vodka.
I remember, and this group now, I mean, they're like, back in like 2000, they, employed really novel techniques to topple a dictator, someone that like everyone around the world despised. But it was a group of like, upstart young activists from the actual country that were able to do it. And I think they've been like advising, groups around the world, in the Arab Spring in particular, on how to, how to effectively use media, how to employ these, various tactics to topple a dictator.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really incredible experience, and they were a bunch of very, very intense young men who were so dedicated and so passionate. It was amazing to watch. how they could pour their passion into blogging. And it was the beginning of that, really. It wasn't, email was still, it wasn't like what it is today. We didn't have devices that we walked around with. I don't even think I had a cell phone. Or if I did, certainly not everybody had a cell phone. It's a very different time period. And in a sense, it's hard to understand now, given the predominance of blogs and Twitter and all of that, how incredible disseminating information like that could be.
So how do you get into Africa issues? I mean, I know you mostly for your research and your work on human rights issues in Africa. Where did that come from?
I have to believe that it came from the early experiences working with my uncle, and just a feeling. My godmother always jokes that everybody's body clock and sort of cultural understanding is aligned to a certain place in the world. It could be your own community, it could be another one. And she always used to joke that for whatever reason, mine was stereotypically aligned to sub-Saharan Africa. Who knows if it's true? But
when was your first trip, your first visit to sub-Saharan Africa?
Oh my God. I started working for Oxfam after grad school, and my first trip to sub-Saharan Africa, actually, it was 2004, 2005, and it was to Sudan. And so I flew to Khartoum with this sort of terrible fear of the genocide that was happening. And I was like, oh my God, it's not just that I'm finally going to Africa, so I'm going to Khartoum. And if you fly to Khartoum, you go at the worst time. Basically, the flight has to be convenient for every other city and country in the world. So you get in the middle of the night. You get in and you leave the airport in the middle of the night. And I was supposed to be picked up by the Oxfam driver, but I guess there had been a miscommunication, and there was nobody to pick me up. And there I am in Khartoum with no working phone. I'm like, what am I going to do? And luckily I met these nice women who worked for another aid organization, and they piled me into their van and luckily I had the hotel name, and they dropped me off at the hotel that I was supposed to stay at. And of course I show up, and there's nobody. It must have been like 4:00 in the morning, and there's some men who are smoking, and that's it. And they take me up to my room, and that was my first experience. And it ended up being a wonderful trip, and I met up with my Oxfam contacts, and we did everything we were supposed to do. Went out to Darfur and sort of did our site visits and everything. But
Wait, so you were able, in your very first trip to sub-Saharan Africa, you went to Darfur.
Yes.
What was,
I got stuck in Darfur too.
So this is 2004 though. This is pretty much the height of the genocide, right? I mean,
yeah, it might have been 2005. We were in El Fasher and sort of going to some of the camps that Oxfam had been working at, and it was, I don't know, this is what humanitarian aid organizations do so well, right? They create community relations so that even in the middle of the worst conflict, you can travel and you can do the things you do. All of these aid groups are doing this not without significant obstacles, but in Syria and in many cases in Iraq. And it was, Oxfam had a huge program in Darfur and was doing incredible life-saving work. And so I went and saw a number of the camps and met with a number of the people that we were serving there. And then we were trying to get back to Khartoum, and our flight went in 17 different directions before going back to Khartoum. And we ended up it was a UN flight, a World Food Program flight, and we ended up getting stuck in West Darfur because the wheel broke and the plane had to unload us. And then they took off because they didn't want to spend the night in West Darfur, so they took off without us. And we had to spend the night Oxfam was closing down its compound, and we were like, there's Janjaweed everywhere. This is not safe, but we had no choice. And I ended up spending the night and then getting on the next plane, and it was sort of this insane experience that now is just sort of part of my experiences. But at that point, I was like, this is how this works. This is both amazing and crazy.
So how long were you with Oxfam then doing this kind of work? And what kind of work were you doing?
I was a humanitarian and conflict policy advisor in DC. And I basically had signed on because they said at that time that sort of the bulk of the work would be Africa focused, and that's what I had gone back to grad school to study. And so I was there for about 3 years, and then I got pulled in to go work for Senator Feingold as his chief foreign policy advisor and also as staff director for the African Affairs Subcommittee.
And that I guess Feingold, he's like, I think well known among people who kind of study Africa as being, someone who, rare for the Senate actually like focuses on these issues.
Yeah.
So what was he like? Like, what was working for Feingold like? I mean, it's funny because he's like mostly known as like the good government campaign finance guy.
Yeah, right.
But his probably most, now that law has been gutted, his most probably enduring impact has to do with U.S. relations to Africa, I'd say.
Yeah, I think he's mostly known, for McCain Feingold, to the point where he talks about how people, at least in Wisconsin, used to ask him if his first name was McCain, right? So, which I thought was very funny. And then, of course, his vote on the Patriot Act, right? The sole vote against the Patriot Act, which happened before I got there. And then his incredible legacy on foreign policy. He served in the Senate for, I think, 17 or 18 years until his defeat in 2010. And he had been active in Africa every single year. He was either chair or ranking of the subcommittee, basically the entire time he was there. And he was tenacious on these issues. And we used to joke in the office that if Africans could vote for Feingold, we'd never have to worry about him losing anything. Because he really believed that he was their voice in the Senate. He was their voice to the administration. And he was a champion of the continent as a place for progress, despite how many crises he was dealing with.
So what issues were you working on in his office? I guess around what year was this?
I joined him in 2007, and then I stayed through his defeat. And, so I had the subcommittee, and I had a team that I worked with, and, we focused on a whole range of African issues. And we tried very much, and this was really with his guidance, not to just be reactive to the crisis of the moment. He wanted to look long-term at democratic trends, and he wanted to look at, how the U.S. could play a role helping address security force abuses or reform, I should say, and sort of root out some of the abuse problems. He had a big portfolio on global health, which had started before I got there. So the subcommittee, we really worked on all of those issues. But then there was his whole other portfolio. I mean, he was the lead Democrat trying to redeploy the U.S. troops from Iraq. And so I spent an incredible amount of time actually working on Iraq issues with him. He was deeply engaged on Afghanistan and Pakistan. And he really believes in government as a force of good. And I think saw part of his job, both his oversight job, was to correct policy that had gone awry, to translate American foreign policy to the American people, and to make sure that all U.S. tools were used, and so that when foreign policy was crafted, that they were thinking about sort of how do you integrate human rights and the rule of law into your bigger foreign policy priorities. And that was a huge challenge. That's still a huge challenge. In fact, that's what I sort of do now every day at Human Rights Watch. But he also was incredibly ahead of the curve. And, I did work with him on AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And I think it was 2009, there were two huge bombs that went off in Algeria, and he did a big, it was 2007 actually. He did a huge force.
Yeah, the UNDP offices in Algeria, right? That was the second at the time. That was like the second biggest attack on the UN, or I think probably had the biggest attack on the UN in history.
Yeah,
and then a few years later, there was an attack in Abuja.
On the UN headquarters.
That was in 2012. Right. Yeah, the UN headquarters. By the time, I mean, that was bad stuff. Yeah.
So he had been watching some of the terrorist threats in North Africa, and he had been keeping his eye on Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen. And we had been sort of pushing things out and trying to develop initiatives from our office to get the administration and others to pay attention to all of these threats, to say it's not just about Al-Qaeda core in Pakistan. And if Al-Qaeda core is in Pakistan, why, Mr. Obama, are you sending more troops to Afghanistan? Let's think about strategically whether the military might is the best way to deal with this. And now, as I look back on that, I realize, and now as everyone's looking at Boko Haram and AQIM and, even Al-Shabaab and all of these different threats, it amazes me how ahead of the curve he was in thinking really comprehensively about U.S. foreign policy and not making sure it's not so myopic that you sort of get sucked into one tunnel, and that's how you see everything. And I have to say, I feel so lucky to have been part of that with him, and it has really influenced my thinking and how I approach my work.
I wanted to ask you how about Congress and Africa. I mean, it seems that, in general, like policy towards Africa writ large does not inspire as much sort of partisan bickering or partisan politicking, even in the Bush administration as well, back in 2007 or 8 when you started with Feingold. Up to today, there is, I guess, some unity on these policies and some divergences as well. But I'm wondering, what are the sources of, in your opinion, of policy on Africa in Congress? I mean, who's creating the policy? To what end? I mean, does the diaspora have a point to play? Are there business interests that are hugely influential? I guess, what are the most influential sources of pressure or policy formation on Africa?
It's a good question, because I think it has been in flux, with Senator Feingold's departure and then Congressman Payne's passing. The longtime champions.
Yeah, Donald Payne. Yeah, he was someone that everyone looked for, and it was oftentimes he was the head of the House Committee on Africa, Subcommittee on Africa for a long time. Right.
And so they're both the fact that they were no longer on Capitol Hill. It was a changing of the guard, if you will, and so the natural tendencies to ask Senator Feingold or Congressman Payne, so other people had to step into that fold, and so it's changed the dynamics entirely. There are still champions, and you're right, it's very bipartisan, except when issues of counterterrorism come up. Then it sort of tends to fall a little bit more along partisan lines. There, obviously certain countries where that's more applicable, but it's been very bipartisan. Senator Coons in the Senate had stepped in incredibly smartly as the junior senator from Delaware, and really just, knocked it out of the park in terms of his interest and his engagement. Up until the Senate just changed him, he had run that subcommittee, I have to say, very impressively, with real knowledge and a real sort of interest and a hunger to learn what he didn't know. We'll see what it looks like in the new Congress. But I have high hopes for Senator Flake. There's less of a collective or a collaborative approach on Africa, I think, than there had been, because there's no clear leader. But increasingly, we're seeing an interest in looking at Africa as an opportunity for economic investment. AGOA has to be reauthorized.
Can you describe AGOA for people who don't know it?
The African Growth and Opportunity Act, I think it actually has to be reauthorized this year. And what it does is it gives, a number of African countries basically access into the U.S. market that they wouldn't otherwise have, with a number of benchmarks and provisions and key issues. It's basically like a free trade, an initial free trade agreement. And it has some incredibly good provisions, and how that progresses, whether other countries will be added to it, and what are some of the other provisions. I think some of the labor rights provisions probably need to be updated. But that's obviously going to garner a lot of interest and a lot of engagement. And the administration has been clear that they want it passed too. So that's going to be an important center point.
Can you do you talk a little bit about what effect AGOA has had in the African countries where that are part of it?
Yeah, if I'm not, to be truthful, I haven't actually worked a ton on AGOA because it was already in motion when I was in the Senate, and it's a little bit outside the scope of my work now. But it's done a couple of things. One is it's created communities within Africa, and sort of country communities that are part of this push to industrialize and build economic opportunities and export them. And that's been really, really valuable for creating a middle class and creating standards and sort of a framework for which many African countries can develop and attract business. That's been also a very important part of it. And I think going forward, there's this real push for increased commercial engagement on the continent. And AGOA has a really strong opportunity to play into that so that African countries can export their goods, that they can also engage with each other, and that they can continue to build a middle class.
So were you with Senator Feingold when he was appointed to be the U.S. Great Lakes envoy?
No, that was after his departure from the Senate.
And so so when he departed the Senate, what did you do? I mean, I always wonder, what happens to staff after their boss leaves? I mean, somehow people find jobs.
Yeah, you do. Actually, it was his defeat was really, was pretty devastating because there's nobody like him in the Senate. So it was devastating for me because I knew I was losing my job, but it was also devastating because I couldn't really imagine working for anybody else in the Senate at that time, and so I knew it also meant that my time had come to an end, and I was sort of shocked, had basically been cut short. And so I took just a few months off, 2 or 3 months off I thought that would clear my head and I could collect my thoughts, but I was actually very wrong. It takes much longer than that. I went to work at the Center for American Progress for only about 18 months in the end. And I brought with me a lot of the issues that I had worked, in Feingold's office and that I cared about. And it was a good platform for me to sort of step back and, have a normal schedule and be in charge of my own focus, frankly, because, when you're working for an active member of Congress, you're pulled in so many different directions. And then I was recruited to come over to Human Rights Watch by my former boss, now Assistant Secretary Tom Malinowski, which in the end, it's a great fit for me. And it's been a great place, and I'm having a ton of fun.
And so what is your job now? I mean, is it mostly lobbying members of Congress and the administration on policies and issues that Human Rights Watch deems important?
So I'm the Washington director, and we have a relatively small Washington office. But I'm doing a couple of things. I mean, I like to think of myself as sort of the strategic guide for the organization, when it comes to the U.S. government. And there are many, many very smart, brilliant people within this organization that know a lot about the U.S. government. But I'm here as a resource to help sort of guide reports and sort of, analysis and recommendations for what, quote unquote, what we should do. I'm here to amplify issues that we care about and priorities. I also take issues back. So if the U.S. government reaches out to me and says, hey, we want your opinion, or can you come brief the Atrocities Prevention Board or something, sometimes it's me who does it, and sometimes I pull in one of my researchers, depending on sort of the level of detail. But I like, I'm a gateway and a strategic thinker and a link. And it's been, I work with all branches of the executive branch, and I work with Congress, and I do a lot of work with the media and with think tanks, and, other operational organizations. And it's so much fun. I mean, this is a very flat organization, and our bread and butter is our research, and it's incredible to watch the researchers do their work, to see how much they know, and then to be able to work with them to craft recommendations that make sense based on what I know about the U.S. government.
So maybe I'll ask you maybe to end with kind of a broad question. So you've been in this line of work now for about 10 years. What international human rights issue have you seen the most progress on? I mean, could you identify an issue where you saw 10 years ago, you couldn't believe the amount of progress we've made 10 years since?
It's a good question. I'd say I've probably been in it longer than 10 years, since 98. So if I go all the way back.
Let's say 15, 20 years.
Yeah,
So in your career in human rights, has there been a specific issue?
Change takes a long time, right? I mean, that's why and I always try to remind everybody, much of the work that I do, you're not going to see tomorrow. You might see a public statement about it, but that doesn't always mean that much. It means someone's paying attention, but we got to match the rhetoric with the policy change. Oh, it's a tough question to answer. I think one of the things we've seen really remarkable change on, and this is a tough issue, I think, for the administration to grapple with on the day-to-day, is accountability and impunity. There have been some incredible successes with the standing up of the International Criminal Court, efforts to build, hybrid courts to hold individuals accountable, whether at the head of state level, which is pretty remarkable, or lower down than that. Efforts to build national courts, and to educate populations and citizenry about why accountability is so important and what it can do. I feel like that's been a tremendous success for the human rights movement overall. In the U.S. context, it's tough to find one thing, but I think I wouldn't call it a success, but I think watching the growth and understanding and awareness of the Lord's Resistance Army and the U.S. response over the last, I would say 6 years, maybe more, has been incredible. The scope of the rebel group to inflict pain and harm and kill people has dramatically shrunk. The capture most recently of Ongwen and transferring him to The Hague is incredible. Efforts at getting combatants and abductees out have had tremendous success, although obviously a lot more is needed. Getting mobile phone communication in these previously almost inaccessible regions has been a huge component. So there's a lot more to do. But when I started working day in, day out on the LRA, I think it was 2005, 2006, and I drafted a bill with one of the guys who went on to found Resolve. And nobody was paying attention to it. It was such an uphill battle. And now it's a known issue. It's a known story. And in some cases, it's a really good example of U.S. commitment to civilian protection and a really good complement of civilian and military tools.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for your time. This was interesting and helpful and illuminating, so thank you. And I will absolutely continue to keep following your work.
Good. Well, I'm happy to talk. Thanks for asking.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Good luck to Sarah Margon in her nomination hearing, and I will be very interested to see how she approaches this senior administration position. And of course, remember to become a premium subscriber to the show to unlock more episodes like this, and also get complimentary copy of the new Global Dispatches podcast book, For the Love of Hong Kong, a memoir from my city under siege by Hannah Mahon Davis. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.